When I was about 7 years old, growing up in Iran, in Buruj, which is 6,426 kilometers, give or take few hundred, from where I'm standing today. Thursdays were special to my sisters and me. Right after school, my sisters and I would walk to my precious maternal grandparents' house for lunch. They live not far from our school, only by their standard, about 4 miles. You see, Thursday at noon was the beginning of the weekend in Iran. After lunch, as we settled in with our homework, I remember vividly that grandfather would take long nap in the adjacent room, but my grandmother always received female guests. As soon as grandfather's head would hit the pillow and his eyes were closed, a fresh teapot in the making with homemade walnut cookies next to the teapot and the table. We were always allowed to stay and continue with our homework. What fascinated me, as young as I was that several women arrived one after another shortly and took seat on the handmade rug around the room. Sometimes conversations was held in a whisper with grandmother, but sometimes it was more of a discussion. It usually involved monetary and domestic violence grievances from her female friends who needed to borrow money from grandmother to make a business transaction without the knowledge of their husbands or their fathers. Every so often, my grandmother would reach out and lift the closest corner of the handmade rug and produce a neat stack of bills. I used to think my grandmother was a magician who could make money appear from under the rug. As these friends would share their stories, I not only listened with my 6-year-old ears, the ones on each side of my head, I learned to listen with my ears in my heart. I would watch grandma's eyes wailing. Her hand would caress her friend's hand so lovingly, but she remained quiet and observant. These stories were common throughout the early years in Iran as the daughter and granddaughter of the most selfless, loving, compassionate, and wise women. Upon their strong framework and foundation of caring for those who have less by empowering them to be self-sufficient, I am driven in my own life to continue their legacy of service to our sisters. In the words of dear Mother Teresa, it is not the magnitude of our action, but the amount of love that is put into them that matters. Fast forward. During my studies of law here at the University of Buffalo School of Law, I discovered the infinite possibilities I had learned from my mother and my grandmothers had returned to me, and I was able to concentrate on the purpose of my legal studies with acute awareness of the transformative power of change. The life of the mind requires community and loving support from colleagues and friends. Much like Professor Sue Mangelt, much like Professor Sue Tompkins, and much like my dear Professor Isabel Marcus. I became the activist that my mother and grandmothers could not become because of the location and patriarchal culture into which they were born. Both my parents emphasized the importance of education as the secret that separates mere existence from a better life, life which is thriving and speaking out. I learned through legal education. I learned from reading about Masters of Change for Women's Advancements, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who spoke about gender equality and gathered assemblies of women when such gatherings were forbidden and unheard of. I learned from Iranian women like Tahireh, who removed her scarf in an assembly for men only, in defiance of man's law of not allowing women into assemblies. My grandmother knew well that economic independence for women was the major step towards reducing domestic violence. My mother knew that setting up a beauty school and providing licensing for young women gave them some economic power, which resulted in having a say in their future husband's choice. I learned by striving to shape history and refusing to let history to shape and change me. Through our founding mothers, I saw a heartbeat of civic community. For the last 2 years, we have marched on the streets of Buffalo, Seneca Falls, Washington, D.C. And wherever there is a need of defiance to inequality and injustice, an ongoing revolution, not in arms, but in mind and in our hearts, which is far more pervasive and powerful. Together we can propel regime and policy changes right here in our own land of the free. I so clearly still hear the sound of my paternal grandmother, who used to tell stories in the form of poetry from Shahnameh, the epic of Iranian kings. She used to talk of bravery of women in battlefields as head of states and as lawmakers. Remembering all the stories from my mother and grandmothers and the stories that I heard in my childhood has been a cellular change in my mind and my body. I ask you, to ask yourself, what is your purpose? What is your purpose? My purpose has been to build a community so everyone has the opportunity for a quality life. It is up to us to create a higher sense of purpose to move forward. Maya Angelou said, when you learn, you teach. When you get, you give. You do not get what you hope for, but what you believe. And it is your belief that will create action. I am making conscious decisions. I know that global education and change starts locally. 2016-2017, we had about 1,900 refugees resettling here. The Coalition for the Advancement of Muslim Women was formed with the intention to help to empower through education one of our most vulnerable communities here in Western New York, the refugees and immigrants. If you believe that education is the base for understanding, compassion, human dignity, and gender equality, and if you believe that through education we have a much better chance to eliminate poverty, and if you believe that education is a right and not a privilege, and it is a right that through that you can take advantage of all other rights, then please help the Coalition for the Advancement of Muslim Women to establish yet another scholarship right here at the law school. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stay.
Thank you.
Stay.